You think you know fear? Nah. You've seen fear in movies and stories, maybe even heard it in someone's voice when they tell you a ghost story or talk about their close call with death. But you don't know it. You don't know what real terror is until you're driving a semi down a stretch of highway, where the blacktop seems to stretch into nothingness, where your only companion is the low hum of the engine, and your eyes start playing tricks on you, making shapes out of shadows that don't belong. When the road itself feels alive and you realize there's something out there in the dark, watching you. I used to laugh at those kinds of stories. Figured it was just folks letting their imagination get the better of them. I ain't laughing anymore. My name's Hank Whitfield, and I've been a long-haul trucker for over 20 years. Seen most every mile of this country's highways and back roads. I've hauled everything from steel beams to frozen meat to circus animals. The road, she's a friend to me. Always has been. Or at least she was, until one night a couple years ago. A night I'll never forget. I'm telling you this now because I don't know how much longer I'll be around to tell it. Something's been following me ever since that night. And I think real soon it's going to catch up to me. So listen close. You might just learn something. Or maybe you'll start looking over your own shoulder when you're out on the road. Because trust me, there's something out there and it's hunting. I was heading west through Arizona, coming out of Phoenix, hauling a load of building supplies bound for some new development in California. Nothing unusual. The haul was light, the weather was good, and I'd been on that stretch of I-10 more times than I could count. The kind of drive that lets your mind wander a little. But that night, something felt off. It was late, around midnight, and I was running through a long, empty stretch of desert. No cars, no lights, just the dark, flat land on both sides of the highway, stretching out into infinity. The stars were bright overhead, but they didn't feel friendly, they just hung there, cold and distant. Even the moon seemed dim, as if it didn't want to shine too bright that night. I'd been driving for about 6 hours straight, and I was getting tired. Decided I'd pull over at a rest stop I knew was coming up in about 20 miles. My eyes were starting to play tricks on me, like they do when you're tired, and I swear I saw something move out there in the desert. Just a shadow, probably, but it caught my attention. I squinted out the side window, but there was nothing there, just sand and scrub brush. I shook my head, chalking it up to exhaustion. That's when I heard it. A whisper, clear as day, even with the rumble of the engine beneath me. It was faint, like someone was sitting right behind me, leaning in close to my ear. It said my name. Hank. I nearly jumped out of my seat. I whipped my head around, expecting to see someone in the cab with me, but of course there was no one. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up and my hands tightened on the wheel. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe my mind messing with me because I was tired. But it wasn't the wind. I know what I heard. I shook it off, focusing back on the road. My headlights sliced through the darkness, but it was like the night was pressing in on me, thicker than it should have been. I flicked on the radio, hoping some music would break the tension, but all I got was static. Every station. It wasn't uncommon out in the middle of nowhere, but still, it felt wrong. Then I saw the truck stop, lights up ahead, a dim glow on the horizon. Relief washed over me. I pulled in, parked the rig, and decided to take a breather. The place was dead quiet. Not a soul around. Just me in the dark. I sat in the cab for a minute, the engine ticking as it cooled, and that's when I noticed something strange. There were no sounds. No crickets. No wind, no distant hum of highway noise. Just nothing. It was like the whole world had gone silent. My skin started to crawl, and I didn't know why. I just felt like something was watching me. I got out of the truck, figuring I'd stretch my legs, maybe get a cup of coffee from the vending machine inside. The rest stop was small, just a couple of vending machines and a bathroom. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a sickly glow over the cracked pavement. As I walked toward the building, I heard footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate. I spun around, expecting to see another trucker or maybe some drifter passing through, but there was no one. The parking lot was empty, save for my rig and the scattered trash blowing across the lot. My heart was pounding now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the shadows. I hurried inside, the door creaking on its hinges, and grabbed a cup of that terrible coffee from the machine. As I leaned against the counter, sipping it, I caught sight of someone in the reflection of the window. A figure, standing by my truck. My stomach dropped. The figure was tall and thin, almost too thin, like a shadow stretched out. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person standing perfectly still. I turned around to look, but when I looked out the window again, the figure was gone. I set my coffee down, my hands shaking. Maybe I was just tired, I told myself. Maybe it was the desert playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I could feel it. I headed back out to the truck, keeping my eyes on the shadows, half expecting that figure to jump out at me. But the lot was empty. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and fired up the engine. I wasn't sticking around to find out what that thing was. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for just a split second, I saw it again. That figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. I drove for another hour, trying to shake the creeping dread that had settled in my bones. The radio was still nothing but static, so I shut it off and focused on the road. The desert was endless, stretching out in all directions, and the darkness felt like it was closing in around me. Then, up ahead, I saw something on the side of the road. A person, standing there with their thumb out. Now I know better than to pick up hitchhikers, especially out in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night. But something about this guy caught my attention. He was just standing there, staring at me as I approached. No movement, no waving, just staring. As I got closer, I could see his face. He looked normal enough. Scruffy beard, worn clothes, the kind of guy you'd expect to see hitchhiking. But his eyes, they were wrong. Too bright, too intense, and they didn't blink. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. I don't know why. Maybe I felt sorry for him, or maybe I was just too curious for my own good. Either way, I stopped, and he climbed up into the cab without a word. The air in the truck felt colder the moment he got inside. "Where are you headed?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though my gut was twisting in knots. He didn't answer right away, just stared out the windshield, his hands resting in his lap. Then, after what felt like forever, he said, "Wherever you're going." I didn't like that answer, not one bit. But what could I do? I wasn't about to throw him out in the middle of the desert. We drove in silence for a while. I kept sneaking glances at him out of the corner of my eye, and the longer he sat there, the more I noticed something strange. He wasn't breathing. Not once did I see his chest rise or fall, and his hands, they were too pale, almost gray. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white, and tried to think of a way to get him out of my truck without causing a scene. That's when he turned to me, those bright, unnatural eyes locking onto mine. "You ever see it?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. "See what?" I asked, my throat dry. "The thing in the dark, the thing that watches." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't answer, but he kept talking. "It's out there, you know, always watching, always waiting. It's hungry." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my cool. "What are you talking about?" He smiled then, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you see in nightmares. "You'll see," he said. "Soon enough, you'll see." I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get rid of this guy, no matter what. So I told him I had to make a stop up ahead at a truck stop to refuel, and that he should find another ride from there. He didn't argue, just nodded, still with that eerie smile on his face. We pulled into the next stop, and I watched as he climbed out of the cab. He didn't say anything else, didn't even look back. He just walked off into the darkness, disappearing behind the building like he'd never been there at all. Relief flooded through me, but it didn't last long. As I pulled out of the truck stop and back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that hitchhiker sitting in the back seat. But no, there was no one there. Then I saw it. A shape darting across the road in the distance. It was fast, too fast to be human. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest, but by the time I got the truck stopped, The road was empty again. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my hands shaking on the wheel. And then, in the silence, I heard it again. That whisper. Hank. My blood turned to ice. I knew then that whatever it wasn't done with me. The hitchhiker's words echoed in my head. It's hungry. I pressed the gas and sped down the highway, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But the faster I went, the more it felt like something was chasing me, keeping pace with the truck, always just out of sight. The shadows on the side of the road seemed to move, shifting and twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist. I could feel it now, like a presence in the cab with me, breathing down my neck. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of something unnatural. I didn't stop driving until the sun started to rise, casting the desert in a pale, golden light. But even then, the feeling didn't go away. I knew it was still out there, waiting. It's been a few years since that night, but the memories haven't faded. In fact, they've only gotten stronger. Every time I hit the road, I feel it. Watching, waiting. I've seen it a few more times since then, always out of the corner of my eye, always in the darkest parts of the night. I've even heard it whisper my name again, once or twice. And every time, I can't help but wonder if this time it's finally going to get me. I don't drive long haul anymore. I stick to short runs now, never too far from the city, never too deep into the dark. But I know it's just a matter of time before it catches up to me, before it takes what it's been after all along. So if you're out there, on the road, and you see something strange in the distance, don't stop. Don't look. And for the love of God, don't pick up any hitchhikers. Because once you've seen it, once you've felt its eyes on you, it never lets go. And one day, when the lights of your rig flicker, and the radio turns to static, you'll know it's come for you too. If there's one thing about trucking that most folks don't understand, it's the isolation. You've got hours, sometimes days, alone on the road, nothing but your thoughts, the hum of the engine, and the distant chatter of the CB radio to keep you company. Some guys learn to love it. Some can't hack it. Me? I've been at it for 15 years, and I guess I'm somewhere in between. My name's Bill Harkins, and I've hauled just about everything you can think of across the highways of America. I know every back road shortcut, every greasy spoon diner, and every truck stop that serves halfway decent coffee. But there's one thing I've learned on those long, lonely nights out there in the middle of nowhere. When you're driving, you've got to be ready for anything. Because the road? It doesn't always play fair. Now, I'm not the kind of guy to buy into ghost stories or trucker myths. I've heard them all over the years. The haunted stretches of highway, the hitchhikers who disappear the moment you let them off, the strange lights in the sky. I figured most of those were just tall tales cooked up by bored drivers trying to keep themselves awake. But one night a few years back, something happened to me out there on the road. Something I can't explain. And to this day, I'm not sure if it was real or if the loneliness of the road finally got to me. This story is about a sound that came through my CB radio. And it wasn't a voice exactly. It was more like a presence. It's hard to explain, but I'll do my best. Because once you've heard something like that, it sticks with you. So here it is, the story of the talker. It was late October, and I was hauling a load of frozen meat from Kansas City down to Albuquerque. I'd been on the road for about 9 hours, and the route was pretty straightforward. Highways all the way, no tricky detours. I had the radio on low, just a bit of background noise to keep me company, but otherwise it was one of those long, quiet drives. The weather was decent, clear skies, cool temperatures, but there was something about the night that felt off. I can't quite explain it, but it was like the air had a weight to it, like something was hanging over me the whole time. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the weariness creeping in. Somewhere outside of Amarillo, I stopped at a truck stop to grab a coffee and stretch my legs. It was a typical spot, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of diesel and cheap fried food in the air. A couple of other truckers were hanging around, but I didn't know them. and they didn't seem too interested in conversation. So I grabbed my coffee, gave my rig a once-over, and got back on the road. The next leg of the trip was the quietest part. It was after midnight, and the highway was nearly empty. Just me, the stars, and the occasional pair of headlights in the distance. I turned on the CB, hoping for some chatter to break the monotony. Channel 19 is usually where you find most of the action, with truckers calling out for weather updates, speed traps, or just shooting the breeze. But that night, it was dead quiet. After a while, I switched it off, figuring I'd focus on the road and make up some time. The miles rolled by, one after another, the same stretch of blacktop disappearing under my wheels. The coffee helped a little, but my eyelids were starting to get heavy. That's when the sound started. At first it was faint, just a low hum, barely audible over the noise of the engine. I thought it might be interference from the radio, so I turned it off completely. But the hum didn't stop. It was still there, just under the surface, like it was coming from inside the truck itself. I checked my mirrors, glanced at the dash, but everything seemed normal. The gauges were fine, no warning lights, no strange vibrations, just that damn hum, steady and constant, buzzing in the background like a mosquito you can't quite swat away. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was maybe a mechanical issue, something minor I could look at when I stopped. But then the sound changed. It wasn't a hum anymore. It was more like a voice, but not a normal voice, not like anything I'd ever heard before. It was garbled, broken up, like it was coming through a bad connection on the CB. I figured someone must have been trying to reach me on one of the channels, so I flipped the radio back on and tuned into channel 19. Nothing, just static. I switched through a few other channels, listening for any sign of chatter, and then, out of the static, I heard it again, clearer this time. "Bill." My heart skipped a beat. There was no mistaking it. It was my name. I grabbed the mic, my hand shaking a little more than I'd like to admit. "Who's out there?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You calling me?" There was a crackle of static, and then silence. I sat there for a minute, waiting for a response, but none came. Just the low hum of the engine and the empty stretch of highway ahead of me. I let go of the mic and tried to calm myself down. It was probably just another trucker messing around, I told myself. Maybe someone with a rig set up to spoof transmissions or something. It happens sometimes. Guys get bored out here and pull pranks. But that voice, it didn't sound like a prank. It didn't sound like anything human, really. It had this metallic quality to it, like it was being run through a machine, distorted and twisted in ways that made my skin crawl. I kept driving, trying to shake the unease that was creeping up my spine. The hum had stopped, but the air inside the cab felt thick, heavy. I cracked the window, hoping the fresh air would help, but it didn't do much. That feeling of being watched, that something wasn't right, was growing stronger by the mile. Another hour passed, and I was starting to think maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. But then the voice came back. "Bill, you hear me?" This time it was clearer, more direct. And it wasn't just a voice coming through the CB, it felt like it was inside the truck, like whoever, or whatever it was sitting right next to me. I grabbed the mic again, my pulse quickening. "Yeah, I hear you. What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. The static crackled, and then a low, distorted laugh echoed through the cab. "Where you headed, Bill?" the voice asked. My blood ran cold. I hadn't mentioned my name on the CB, not once. No one out here knew who I was or where I was going. My hand tightened on the wheel, knuckles white. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. The laugh came again, and then the voice responded, slow and deliberate. "You're headed for the dark, Bill. It's waiting for you." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. It was like the voice was coming from nowhere, like it wasn't even using the CB to reach me. It was just there. I slammed the mic down, heart pounding, and pressed the gas a little harder. The truck roared as it picked up speed, the highway blurring past in the darkness. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to glance at the radio, refusing to acknowledge that feeling of dread creeping up my spine. But it didn't stop. The voice kept talking. "You can't outrun it, Bill. It's already with you." I gripped the wheel so tight my fingers ached. The voice was getting louder now, more insistent, like it was feeding off my fear. "It's been following you for a long time, Bill. It's almost here." I slammed the CB off, ripping the cord from the dash. The voice cut out immediately, leaving me in the silence of the cab. My heart was racing, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool night air. I told myself it was over, that whatever weirdness had come through the radio was done with, but deep down I knew that wasn't the case. I drove on, the miles ticking by, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The stars overhead seemed dimmer now, and the empty road stretched out in front of me like an endless ribbon of black. There were no other cars, no signs of life, just me and the dark. And then up ahead, I saw it. At first it was just a shadow, a shape moving in the distance, barely visible in the headlights. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was something else. A figure standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes hard, the truck lurching as it slowed to a crawl. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, blocking the road, its features obscured by the darkness. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, trying to get a better look. My headlights caught a glimpse of something, pale skin, long limbs, but before I could make out any details, it vanished. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my heart hammering in my chest. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and I could feel the panic rising in my throat. And then the voice came back. "You're almost there, Bill. Almost home." This time it wasn't coming through the CB. It was coming from inside the truck. I froze, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. The air in the cab was thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. I could feel the weight of someone, sitting in the passenger seat next to me. Slowly I turned my head. The seat was empty, but the voice was still there, whispering in my ear, low and insistent. "You can't run from it, Bill. You can't hide." I slammed the truck into gear and floored the gas, the tires screeching as I tore down the highway. The dark blur of the desert flew past, the speedometer climbing higher and higher. But no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me, just out of sight, waiting for the moment to strike. I drove for what felt like hours, the fear gnawing at my insides, the voice still whispering in the back of my mind. My hands were shaking, my body drenched in sweat. I didn't know where I was going anymore, didn't care. I just wanted to get away from that voice, from whatever was out there in the dark. And then, suddenly, the road ahead of me lit up with the bright glow of headlights. A rest stop. I could see the familiar neon lights, the gas pumps, the small convenience store. It was a lifeline, a beacon in the darkness. Without thinking, I pulled off the highway and parked the rig in the lot, the engine ticking as it cooled. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my heart still racing. The voice was gone. The air in the cab felt normal again. No more oppressive weight, no more whispers. Just silence. I climbed out of the truck and headed into the rest stop, my legs shaking beneath me. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and a bored-looking cashier stood behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. I grabbed a cup of coffee, hoping it would calm my nerves, and leaned against the counter, trying to make sense of what had just happened. As I stood there, sipping the lukewarm coffee, I glanced at the CB radio on the counter behind the cashier. It was tuned to channel 19, and I could hear the faint crackle of static coming through. And then out of the static I heard it again. "Bill." I dropped the coffee, the cup shattering on the floor. The cashier looked up, startled, but I didn't care. My blood had turned to ice. The voice was still out there, waiting for me. "I don't drive long haul anymore. After that night I couldn't do it. The isolation, the long stretches of road, the dark highways. It was too much. I took a local route, sticking close to home, where I could sleep in my own bed at night, where I didn't have to worry about voices in the dark. But every now and then, when I'm driving down a quiet road in the dead of night, I'll hear it again, just a faint whisper, barely audible over the hum of the engine. Bill. And I know deep down that it's still out there, whatever it is, and one day it's going to find me. There's something about driving through the night that gets into your head. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 20 years now, and I still haven't quite gotten used to it. The endless hours of highway, the hum of the engine, the faint glow of the dashboard in the dark. There's an isolation to it that's hard to explain. You learn to live with the silence. Some guys blast the radio to drown it out. Me, I've always preferred the quiet. That night, though, the quiet was different. It was heavier, like something was sitting just outside the reach of my headlights, waiting. I was on Route 41, deep in the heart of Oklahoma. I'd taken that road 100 times, but it had never felt so lonely. No cars, no towns, just miles of asphalt stretching out before me, cutting through the black. The clock on the dash read 2:13 a.m., and I knew I had another few hours before I could stop at a trucker-friendly rest area I knew about just off the interstate. I wasn't tired, not yet. My thermos was still full of coffee, and the engine's steady growl kept me alert enough. But the air felt thick, almost oppressive, like a storm was about to break. I rolled down the window a crack, hoping the cool breeze would clear my head. I had just passed a sign for the next town, still over 50 miles away, when I saw him. He appeared out of nowhere on the side of the road, standing as still as a statue, his thumb sticking out like a signal from some old movie. I hit the brakes instinctively, my heart jumping into my throat. It was rare to see hitchhikers these days, especially in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night. Most people knew better than to be out on a road like this. It wasn't exactly the safest place, and you never knew who you might run into. My first thought was to keep driving. It wasn't safe to pick up strangers, and every trucker knows that rule. We hear the stories, the urban legends about serial killers, robbers, or just plain crazies who hitch rides. But as I slowed down and got a better look at him, something stopped me from driving on. The guy looked young, maybe in his early 20s. He was wearing a beat-up flannel shirt, torn jeans, and boots that were caked in dirt. His hair was messy, and he looked pale, like he hadn't seen the sun in a while. There was something about the way he stood there, though, completely still, like he'd been frozen in place for hours, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself to just keep going. He'd find another ride, or he'd figure something out. But my foot was already on the brake, and before I knew it, I was pulling over to the side of the road. "You need a lift?" I called out, rolling the window down just enough to be heard. My voice sounded shaky in the stillness of the night, and I could hear my own breath over the sound of the engine. For a moment, the guy didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the ground. Then slowly he looked up at me. His eyes were dark, almost hollow, and for a second I regretted stopping. But then he nodded, and without a word, he walked over to the passenger side of the cab. He climbed in silently, closing the door behind him with a soft click. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye as I pulled back onto the road. He was sitting stiffly, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He hadn't said a word since getting in, and that silence was starting to creep under my skin. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to break the tension. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet cab. "Up the road," he said after a long pause. His voice was low, barely above a whisper, and there was something strange about the way he said it, like he didn't quite know the answer himself. I nodded, not really sure what else to say. I wasn't about to press him for details, and the road ahead stretched out long and empty, with no sign of civilization in sight. I figured I'd drop him off at the next town, whatever it was, and then keep going. The highway felt endless. The further we drove, the darker it seemed to get, the road swallowed by shadows that my headlights couldn't quite penetrate. I tried to focus on the white lines ahead, the hum of the engine, the steady thump of the tires on the asphalt. But my eyes kept drifting to the guy next to me. He was too still. His hands never moved. His eyes didn't flicker or glance around like most people would in a new place. It was like he wasn't really there. I glanced at him again, and this time I noticed something that made my skin crawl. His clothes, they were wrong. Not just dirty or worn, but outdated, like they were from a different time. His flannel shirt had those old-style pearl snaps that you don't see much anymore, and his jeans had a cut that reminded me of the kind my dad used to wear back in the 70s. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. I tried to push the thought away. Maybe he was just some kid from a small town, stuck in his dad's old clothes. Maybe he was homeless, down on his luck. There had to be a logical explanation. But the silence between us was suffocating, and every mile we drove felt like it was stretching out longer than the last. After what felt like hours, I reached for the radio. I hadn't turned it on yet, but I figured some music or chatter would help drown out the weird tension in the cab. As soon as I flicked it on, though, all I got was static. I tried scanning through the channels, but it was the same on every frequency, just white noise, crackling and popping. That didn't make sense. I'd never had issues with the radio out here before. I turned the dial again, but still nothing. The hitchhiker shifted in his seat, and I felt his eyes on me for the first time since he got in. I glanced over at him, and his gaze was locked on the radio, his expression unreadable. For a second, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, something like recognition, or maybe fear. But it was gone as soon as it appeared. "I don't like the radio," he said suddenly, his voice flat and distant. I let go of the dial, my hand hovering in the air. His words hung between us, strange and out of place. I turned the radio off without saying anything and focused on the road again. We drove on in silence for what felt like forever. The road was completely empty. No other cars, no lights, no towns. Just the endless stretch of highway and the night pressing in from all sides. I kept glancing at the clock on the dash, but it seemed stuck, the minutes barely creeping by. I don't know how much time passed before the hitchhiker spoke again, but when he did, it caught me off guard. "You can let me off up here," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. I looked around, squinting into the darkness. There was nothing up ahead. No exits, no turnoffs, not even a mile marker. Just more road. "Here?" I asked, confused. "There's nothing out here, man." He didn't answer right away, but I saw his hand tighten on the armrest. "It's fine," he said, a little more forcefully this time. "Just, here's fine." I slowed the truck, unsure of what to do. There was no shoulder to pull off onto, just the narrow strip of asphalt and a steep drop into the trees below. But something in his voice made me uneasy, like he needed to get out, like he couldn't be in the truck any longer. Reluctantly, I brought the rig to a stop on the side of the road. The hitchhiker was out of the cab before I could say anything else, his boots hitting the pavement with a soft thud. He stood there for a moment, his back to me, staring off into the woods. I leaned out the window. "You sure you'll be all right out here?" I called, my voice louder than I intended. He didn't turn around. "Thanks," he said quietly. almost too quietly to hear over the engine. I watched him walk away, disappearing into the shadows as if the night had swallowed him whole. The moment he was out of sight, a chill ran down my spine, and the urge to get out of there hit me like a freight train. I shifted the truck into gear and drove off, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. For the next few miles, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the cab felt colder, and my hands were clammy on the wheel. I kept glancing at the passenger seat, expecting to see him there, still sitting stiffly with his hands on his knees. But the seat was empty. It wasn't until I was halfway to the next town that I noticed the seatbelt. It was still fastened. The passenger side belt was clicked in tight, even though he hadn't worn it when he got in, and I hadn't heard him buckle or unbuckle it. My stomach twisted into knots as I stared at it, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. I unbuckled the belt, the click echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. My hands were shaking now, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I couldn't explain it. None of it made sense. When I finally pulled into the rest stop, I was rattled. My nerves shot. I parked the truck and sat there for a long time, staring out at the dimly lit lot. The hitchhiker's face kept flashing in my mind. Those hollow eyes, that strange stillness. Something was wrong with him. Something had been wrong from the moment I picked him up. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing the soft click of the seatbelt in my head, over and over, until it blended with the sound of the wind outside. A couple of days later, I was back on Route 41, making another delivery. It was early evening this time, the sun just starting to set, casting long shadows across the road. As I passed the spot where I'd picked up the hitchhiker, something caught my eye. There, by the side of the road, was a small wooden cross, standing crooked in the dirt. It was simple, unadorned, with a name carved into the wood. I slowed down as I passed, squinting to make out the words. John Hartley. Beneath the name was a date, October 22, 1984, nearly 40 years ago. My stomach twisted, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. The date matched the clothes, the demeanor, the feeling of being out of time. I floored the gas pedal and didn't look back. Since then, I've avoided Route 41 whenever I can. But on the nights when I can't, when I have no choice but to drive that lonely stretch of road, I keep my eyes glued to the pavement, never looking at the side of the road, and I make sure to never ever pick up a hitchhiker, because sometimes what's standing there isn't meant to be picked up, and sometimes the dead are looking for more than just a ride. I've been driving trucks for nearly 15 years now. You get used to the loneliness, the endless stretch of road that seems to melt into the horizon. It's just you, the rig, and the hum of the engine, hour after hour, day after day. I don't mind it, though. There's something calming about the isolation, something that makes the world feel far away, like all the problems in my life are back there in the rearview mirror. This night was different, though. Something about it felt off from the start. I had just picked up a load in Denver and was making my way through the mountains of Colorado, headed toward Salt Lake City. The highway I usually took, Route 70, had been closed off due to a rock slide, so dispatch told me to detour onto Highway 52. I'd never driven that road before, but I figured it would be a decent enough route, a shortcut even. I'd get through the mountains quicker and have fewer stops along the way. I wasn't worried at first. The evening was calm, the sky a dark, inky blue with a few stars peeking through. The air was crisp, like it always is up in the mountains, and the road was surprisingly empty for that time of night. Maybe a few sedans here and there, but no other rigs. It wasn't until I hit the higher elevation that the fog rolled in. It started as a low mist, swirling around the tires of my truck, barely noticeable, but the higher I climbed, the thicker it got. By the time I was halfway through the pass, I could barely see more than 10 feet ahead of me. My high beams were useless, just bouncing off the fog and making the world look like a white void. I'd slowed to about 30 miles an hour when my CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker, breaker, this is Night Owl." Anyone got their ears on? The voice came through, loud and clear, cutting through the static. I glanced at the radio, a little surprised. I hadn't heard anyone on the CB all night. I hadn't seen any other trucks on this stretch of road either. I figured I must not be the only one taking this detour after all. I picked up the mic. "This is Big Red, I hear you, Night Owl. Where you headed?" There was a long pause before the voice came back, the static in the background growing louder. "Same as you, brother. Just trying to get through this damn fog." His voice sounded calm enough, but there was something about it, something that made my skin prickle, like a faint undercurrent of unease. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the eerie atmosphere getting to me. I'd been driving in worse conditions than this before. It wasn't like a little fog was going to rattle me. "Yeah, this fog's something else," I replied, glancing out at the swirling white around me. "Haven't seen anything this thick in years. You near the pass?" Another pause, longer this time. "Yeah," he said finally. "Not far. Keep your lights low, brother. There's something out here." That last part caught me off guard. There was something strange about the way he said it, like he was talking about more than just the fog. I wanted to ask what he meant, but the crackle of the radio cut him off before I could say anything. I tightened my grip on the wheel and leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. The road was still empty, just two thin lines of yellow marking the lanes, barely visible through the haze. I flicked my low beams on, following his advice, but it didn't make much of a difference. The fog was thick, hanging low like a blanket over the pass. For a while, the radio stayed quiet. I kept driving, the white line disappearing under my truck's nose and reappearing in the rearview mirror, the only sign I was still on the road. I turned up the heat in the cab, trying to chase off the chill that had crept into my bones. My thermos sat in the cup holder, still half full of coffee, but I didn't bother with it. Something about the fog made me feel like I needed to keep my hands on the wheel, like if I let go, I'd lose control. It was then that I saw them. Up ahead, a convoy of trucks. Their taillights flickered in the distance, barely visible through the mist. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was a relief to see other rigs on the road, like some proof that I wasn't alone up here in this strange, deserted stretch of highway. I pushed the pedal down a little, closing the distance between us. There were 3 of them, all moving slowly through the fog, their headlights cutting thin beams into the mist. I radioed in again. "Night Owl, this is Big Red. I'm coming up on a convoy here. You with them?" His voice was lower this time, almost a whisper, like he was trying not to be overheard. I eased off the gas a little, keeping a steady distance behind the last truck. The fog swirled around us, making it hard to tell where the road ended and the air began. Every now and then, the red lights of the convoy would flicker, then disappear into the mist, only to reappear a second later. I settled into the rhythm of it, following the convoy as we climbed higher into the mountains. The road wound tighter here, sharp turns hugging the edge of steep drop-offs that were hidden by the fog. I could feel the weight of the load behind me as I navigated the curves, the truck groaning under the strain. But I kept my eyes on the convoy, making sure I didn't lose them. The CB crackled again. "You ever been on this road before?" Night Owl asked, his voice cutting through the static. "First time," I replied. "Didn't even know it existed until tonight." Another long pause. The silence stretched out between us, filled only by the hum of the engine and the steady thrum of the tires on the wet asphalt. Then, quietly, almost too quiet to hear, Night Owl said, "This ain't no ordinary road, brother." I felt a shiver run down my spine, the kind you get when someone's walked over your grave. I opened my mouth to ask him what the hell he meant, but before I could speak, the truck in front of me started to flicker. At first, I thought it was just the fog playing tricks on my eyes. The red tail lights blinked once, then twice, then vanished altogether. I blinked, leaning forward, trying to see through the white haze, but there was nothing, just empty road where the truck had been. "Night Owl?" I called into the mic, my heart hammering in my chest. "I lost visual on the lead truck. You still there?" No answer. I swallowed hard and slowed down, my eyes scanning the fog for any sign of movement. The two remaining trucks ahead of me were still there, their lights cutting faint beams through the mist. I tried to shake off the sudden spike of panic crawling up my throat. Maybe the lead truck had just turned off or taken an exit I hadn't seen. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. We kept driving, the fog growing thicker by the minute. The remaining two trucks loomed ahead of me, their shapes barely visible in the swirling mist. I flicked the radio again, hoping for some reassurance. "Night Owl, you still with me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. Then, after a long, painful moment, the crackle of the CB returned. "I'm here, brother," he said, his voice low and distant, like he was speaking from 100 miles away. "Just stay close. Don't lose the lights." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, my grip tightening on the wheel. The fog was pressing in on all sides now, thick and suffocating. My headlights barely made a dent in it, and I had to rely on the dim glow of the convoy's lights to guide me. But something wasn't right. The air felt heavier, colder, like the fog itself was alive, breathing down my neck. And then, without warning, the second truck vanished. 1 minute it was there, its tail lights blinking faintly through the mist, and the next, it was gone. Just like that. No turn, no exit, no sound, just gone. I slammed on the brakes, my truck skidding slightly on the slick road. My heart was pounding in my chest, the blood roaring in my ears. I stared at the spot where the truck had been, but there was nothing. Just empty road and the thick swirling fog. "Night Owl!" I yelled into the radio, panic creeping into my voice now. "What the hell is going on? Where did they go?" The CB crackled, but this time there was no voice, just static. Loud, oppressive static that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, my hand shaking on the wheel. I was alone now. Completely alone. The static from the CB filled the cab, a loud and disorienting noise that grated on my nerves. I fumbled with the dial, trying to clear it up, but it only grew louder, as if the static itself was crawling out of the speakers. My heart was still racing. The image of the second truck vanishing into thin air seared into my mind. There was no explanation for it. None. I forced myself to keep driving, eyes glued to the road, hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The last truck in the convoy was still up ahead, but it looked like a ghostly shadow in the mist, its lights faint and flickering. "Night Owl, talk to me, man. What the hell is happening?" I called into the radio again, hoping, praying he would answer. For a long moment, nothing but static hissed through the speakers. Then, finally, his voice came through, quieter this time, almost muffled by the interference. "Just keep moving, brother. Whatever you do, don't stop." "Don't stop?" I echoed, incredulous. "Two trucks just disappeared in front of me. How am I supposed to—" "Don't stop!" His voice was sharp now, desperate, cutting through the static like a knife. "Keep going, Big Red. Stay close. But whatever you do, don't pull over." A cold sweat trickled down my spine as I processed his words. My instincts were screaming at me to stop, to pull over and figure out what the hell was going on. But something in his voice, a fear I hadn't heard in all my years of trucking, kept me from doing it. Night Owl had been calm when we first spoke, but now there was a kind of terror in his voice that chilled me to my core. I swallowed hard, glancing at the truck ahead. Its lights flickered again, barely visible through the thickening fog. I couldn't lose it. I had to stay close, like Night Owl said. There was something out there in that fog, something I couldn't see but could feel, like an invisible presence pressing down on me. As we continued to climb the narrow mountain road, the fog seemed to pulse with every bend and turn. My headlights were practically useless now, and I relied entirely on the faint glow of the last truck's taillights to guide me. Every now and then they would flicker, like a candle about to go out, and my heart would skip a beat. I couldn't afford to lose it, not after what had happened to the others. The CB crackled to life again, and this time Night Owl's voice was barely audible through the static. "You ever heard the stories about this road?" I shook my head, then realized he couldn't see me. "No," I said, my voice tight with anxiety. "What stories?" The radio went silent for a moment, and I thought I'd lost him again. Then his voice returned, low and grave, almost as if he didn't want to be overheard. "They say this road ain't like the others. People go missing up here. Convoys vanish, rigs disappear, and no one ever finds them. It's like the fog swallows them whole." My blood turned to ice. I'd heard plenty of ghost stories over the years, but none that ever unsettled me like this. Maybe it was the atmosphere, the fog, the isolation, or maybe it was the fact that I had just seen 2 trucks vanish right in front of me. But Night Owl wasn't telling this like a story. He was telling it like it was the truth. "That's crazy," I muttered, but my voice was shaky, the confidence I tried to muster falling flat. "Trucks don't just disappear." "Tell that to the rigs that never made it out of here," Night Owl replied, his voice hard. "This road, it does something to you. Time don't move right up here. Things don't move right." A chill crawled up my neck, and I instinctively glanced at the clock on my dash. It read 3:15 a.m., the same time it had shown for the past 30 minutes. My stomach twisted into knots as I stared at it, waiting for the minutes to change. But they didn't. It was like time had frozen, stuck in place while we drove through this endless fog. "I don't know what's out there," Night Owl continued, his voice barely a whisper now. "But once you're in it, you can't stop. You can't look back." My mind raced. I wanted to argue, to tell him that none of this made any sense, that it was impossible. But how could I argue with what I was seeing? 2 trucks had vanished without a trace. The fog was thicker than any I'd ever driven through, and now apparently time itself wasn't working right. The cold weight of fear pressed down on me, heavier with each passing mile. And then, as if to punctuate his words, the last truck in the convoy blinked out of existence. 1 second it was there, its faint red lights glowing in the distance, and the next, it was gone. Vanished. Just like the others. "Night Owl!" I shouted into the radio, my heart pounding in my chest. "Night Owl, where are you?" The static roared back at me, louder than ever, drowning out any hope of a response. I hit the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the wet road, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I was completely alone. The silence was deafening. I sat there for a long moment, my hands shaking on the wheel, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. The convoy was gone. Night Owl was gone. I was alone in the thick fog, on a road that felt like it had no end. The clock on the dash still read 3:15 a.m., the minutes frozen in place, as if time itself had stopped. My breathing was shallow, panic rising in my chest. I needed to get out of here. I needed to move, to keep driving like Night Owl had said. But the thought of continuing down this cursed road, with no idea where it led or what might be waiting in the fog, terrified me. I reached for the radio one last time, desperate for some kind of response. "Night Owl, come on, man. Say something." Nothing but static. I slammed the mic down and gritted my teeth. I couldn't just sit here. I had to keep moving, even if I didn't know where the hell I was going. I forced my foot back onto the gas and started driving again, my eyes fixed on the white line that barely peeked through the fog. I didn't know where the road would take me, but anything was better than staying in one place, waiting for whatever was out there to find me. The fog was so thick now that I couldn't see more than 5 feet ahead. The world around me felt smaller, like the air itself was closing in, suffocating me. The road wound tighter, the turns sharper, and my hands gripped the wheel like a lifeline. The fear in my chest had settled into a dull, constant thrum, a background noise that kept me on edge. And then, without warning, the fog began to lift. It didn't clear all at once, but slowly, like a veil being drawn back. The white mist thinned out, revealing the road ahead in jagged patches. My heart pounded as I stared at the open asphalt in front of me. The fog was retreating, pulling away from the mountain pass like it had never been there in the first place. I kept driving, afraid to stop even as the fog cleared completely. The road stretched out before me, winding down the mountain, the night sky opening up above me. Stars blinked overhead, distant and cold, and the moon hung low on the horizon, casting a pale glow over the landscape. I glanced at the clock again. It read 4:45 a.m. I blinked in disbelief. It had been stuck at 3:15 for what felt like hours, and now suddenly time had jumped forward. I didn't know whether to be relieved or more terrified. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. The CB crackled to life one last time, and I nearly jumped out of my seat. "Big Red," Night Owl's voice came through, faint but clear. "You made it out." My hands trembled as I picked up the mic. "Night Owl, where are you? What the hell just happened back there?" There was a long pause, and I could hear the faint sound of static in the background. Then quietly he said, "Some of us don't make it out, brother. You were lucky. Don't take this road again." And with that, the radio went silent for good. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. I kept driving, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. My mind was a jumble of fear, confusion, and exhaustion, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to take Highway 52 ever again. By the time I reached Salt Lake City, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the mountains. The memory of the night lingered in my mind, haunting me with every mile I drove. I couldn't shake the image of those trucks disappearing into the fog, couldn't forget the sound of Night Owl's voice, warning me to keep moving. I still drive long hauls, but every now and then, when I'm on a quiet road in the middle of the night, I catch myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those faint red lights flickering in the distance. And when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I remember Night Owl's warning. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled. I've been a trucker for nearly 2 decades, and I've seen my share of weird things out on the road. You get used to the endless monotony, the strange characters at truck stops, and the occasional unsettling hitchhiker. But there are still moments when something feels off, when a routine haul turns into something more sinister, and you realize there's no way to explain what just happened. This is one of those stories. It started out like any other job, a late-night call from dispatch with an urgent haul. The cargo? I didn't know, and I didn't ask. That's how it is sometimes. You get the load, you sign the paperwork, and you hit the road. I wasn't too bothered. It paid well, and I was used to these last-minute gigs. I'd just finished a run from Phoenix to Kansas City and was looking forward to a night's rest when dispatch told me about this new route, a hefty bonus for same-day delivery, and they'd even top off my tank for free. Hard to say no to that. They gave me an address, somewhere off a remote highway in Wyoming, and told me to get there by dawn. "No stops," the dispatcher warned. "You've got to stay on schedule no matter what." I'd heard warnings like that before. Sometimes the client wants something delivered quick and discreet, no questions asked. Fine by me. It wasn't the first time I'd transported something weird, and I was sure it wouldn't be the last. By the time I hit the road, it was just after midnight. The night was clear, the air cool, and the highway was deserted. It was one of those stretches where you can drive for hours without seeing another set of headlights. A lot of truckers hate that kind of isolation, but I find it peaceful. Just me, my rig, and the road. What could go wrong? The first few hours were uneventful. I kept my speed steady, around 65, and the miles ticked by like they always do. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic bounce of the wheels on the asphalt were the only sounds in the cab. Every now and then, I'd flip through the radio stations, but it was mostly static out here. I settled on some classic rock, turned down low, and focused on the road ahead. It wasn't long after I hit the Wyoming border that things started to feel strange. I don't know how to explain it, but there was a change in the air. The sky seemed darker, the road narrower, as if the landscape itself had shifted while I wasn't looking. The GPS said I was on the right route, but the highway felt unfamiliar, like I was driving into uncharted territory. The first sign of trouble came when the radio cut out entirely. Not just static this time. Nothing. I twisted the dial, flipped through every channel, but there wasn't a single signal to be found. Dead silence. I glanced at the GPS on the dash, but it was still working, showing the same route with no issues. I shook off the unease creeping up my spine. This was the middle of nowhere after all. Losing radio signal wasn't exactly unheard of. But then the CB went quiet too. One minute I was picking up bits and pieces of trucker chatter, mostly guys further south talking about the weather. Then, out of nowhere, it all went dead. No static, no voices, just silence. I tried not to think too much about it. I had a job to do, so I kept driving. The road stretched out in front of me, the white lines disappearing into the darkness. The miles kept ticking by, but something felt off. It was hard to pinpoint at first, but the more I drove, the more it gnawed at me. The road was too empty. I mean, it's not unusual to go long stretches without seeing other cars, especially in the middle of the night. But this was different. There weren't even any signs of life. No distant headlights, no glow from small towns, no rest stop signs, no mile markers. Just an endless, unchanging stretch of highway. And then there was the time. I checked the clock on the dash. It read 3:30 a.m. That didn't seem right. I'd been driving for hours, and I was certain it should have been later than that. I figured maybe the clock had reset or there was some kind of glitch. I wasn't too concerned about it at first, but it stayed stuck at 3:30. Even after what felt like another hour of driving, it hadn't budged. I started feeling uneasy. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to shake it off, focus on the road, but the longer I drove, the worse it got. The highway ahead of me looked exactly the same as it had 20 minutes ago. No turns, no exits, no changes in the scenery, just the same empty, barren landscape. I glanced at the GPS again. It showed me driving along the route, but there was something off about the screen. The little blue line representing the road seemed to loop back on itself, like I was going in circles. But the road itself was straight. I hadn't made any turns. What the hell? I muttered under my breath, feeling the first stirrings of real fear. I slowed down, debating whether to pull over and check the GPS or maybe try to call dispatch. But the warning from earlier echoed in my head. No stops. That's what they said. Stay on schedule, no matter what. It seemed like a stupid thing to fixate on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that stopping would make things worse. So I kept driving. The road continued on, unchanging, like a nightmare that stretched into infinity. My eyes were starting to play tricks on me. I could have sworn I saw shapes in the fog that had started to creep along the edges of the road, shadows shifting just out of reach of my headlights. I blinked hard, trying to focus, telling myself it was just my mind messing with me. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every mile. I passed a road sign, or at least I think I did. It flickered in my headlights just for a second, and then it was gone. No writing, no indication of how far I had to go. Just a blank, rusted signpost standing like a sentinel in the mist. I had the sudden, unsettling realization that I had no idea where I was anymore. The GPS was still showing me on course, but the landscape didn't match anything I'd seen before. It was all wrong, too flat, too empty. Wyoming had hills, valleys, mountain ranges, but this was just nothing. Then the lights flickered. Just for a second, the headlights dimmed and the dashboard lights went out. My heart lurched in my chest, and I tapped the brakes, slowing down to a crawl. I couldn't afford to lose power out here in the middle of nowhere. The lights flickered again. This time they stayed off for longer, 3, maybe 4 seconds. In that brief moment of darkness, I could feel the weight of the night pressing in on me, thick and oppressive. The engine sputtered but didn't die. When the lights finally came back on, I took a deep breath and pushed the truck forward. But something had changed. I could feel it, even before I saw it. There was something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering in my chest. The truck lurched to a stop, the tires screeching on the asphalt. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, bathed in the glow of my headlights. At first I thought it was a person. A man, maybe, standing there like he'd been waiting for me. But as I squinted through the windshield, I realized something was wrong. The figure was too still, too rigid. Its shape wasn't quite right, its arms too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I blinked, and in that split second it was gone. I stared at the spot where it had been, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. There was no way. I'd seen it. I was sure of it. But now there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out ahead of me. I wanted to pull over, to take a minute and collect myself, but that warning kept ringing in my ears. No stops. I pressed my foot to the gas and started moving again, trying to ignore the dread curling in my gut. The road was starting to feel like a trap, like I was stuck in some kind of loop with no way out. That's when I saw the headlights behind me. At first, they were just faint specks in the distance, barely noticeable through the rearview mirror. But they grew closer, faster than seemed possible. I glanced in the mirror again, my pulse quickening. There was something wrong with the lights. They were too bright, too steady, like they didn't belong to any car I'd ever seen. The headlights kept gaining on me, closing the distance between us in seconds. I hit the gas, pushing the truck to its limit, but the lights stayed with me, following my every move. My knuckles were white on the wheel, sweat dripping down the back of my neck. I don't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to look directly at the headlights. Something in the back of my mind was screaming at me not to, telling me that if I did, I'd see something I wasn't supposed to. So I kept my eyes on the road, praying that the lights would disappear. They didn't. The truck shuddered, the engine groaning under the strain. But I couldn't slow down. The headlights were so close now that I could feel the heat of them on my back, like they were right behind me, ready to swallow me whole. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights vanished. I glanced in the mirror. Nothing. No car, no headlights. Just the empty road stretching out behind me. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. What the hell had just happened? Where had those lights come from? Where had they gone? I didn't have time to think about it. Up ahead in the distance, I saw it. A gas station. Relief flooded through me at the sight of it, its dim neon sign flickering weakly in the fog. I hadn't seen a single sign of life for hours, and now, finally, there was a place to stop. I didn't care about the dispatcher's warning anymore. I needed to stop, to get out of the truck and breathe. I pulled into the station's gravel lot, the tires crunching under the weight of the rig, and killed the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. I climbed out of the truck, my legs shaky beneath me, and made my way toward the station. The air was cold, the fog thick around me, but the station's neon light cast a faint, eerie glow over everything. The door creaked as I pushed it open, stepping into the dimly lit room. The place was empty. No clerk, no customers. Just rows of shelves, stocked with dusty goods, and a faint smell of gasoline lingering in the air. I approached the counter, glancing around for any sign of life, but there was no one. I leaned over the counter and saw an old, flickering radio sitting on a shelf behind it, playing soft, crackling music. The station itself felt frozen in time, like it hadn't been touched in years. That's when I saw the clock on the wall, The hands were stuck, unmoving, frozen at 3:30 a.m. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be. I looked at my watch. 3:30. My phone? 3:30. I bolted out of the gas station and back to my truck. I had to get out of there. Whatever was happening, I needed to keep moving. I jumped into the cab, started the engine, and peeled out of the lot, not daring to look back. As I sped down the road, the fog began to lift again, just like before. The stars reappeared, the night sky opening up above me. But the dread in my chest didn't ease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped, that whatever had followed me on that road was still out there, watching. By the time I reached my destination, the sun was rising. I parked the truck in the lot and sat there for a long time, staring at the sky, trying to make sense of what had happened. But I couldn't. The road had taken something from me, something I couldn't explain. And no matter how many miles I drive, no matter how many nights pass, I'll never forget the feeling of being trapped on that endless highway, driving toward nowhere. There are things you hear about out on the road, stories passed down from one trucker to the next over greasy diner counters and late-night radio chatter. I never gave much thought to them. They were just stories after all. Tall tales meant to keep us entertained on those long, empty stretches of highway. But after what I've been through, I know better now. Some stories are real. It started a few years ago on a run from Amarillo to Memphis. The route was familiar to me. I'd driven it countless times before, but this time was different. I should have known something was off from the start, but it wasn't until it was too late that I realized what was happening. I was on I-40, somewhere between the Texas-Oklahoma border and Little Rock. The sun had set hours ago, and the road ahead was swallowed by the inky darkness of a clear, moonless night. My rig's headlights cut through the black, but it felt like I was the only person for miles. No other cars, no trucks, just me and the hum of the engine as I rolled down that endless stretch of highway. I'd been making good time. The road was dry and the skies were clear, but as the miles ticked by, the quiet began to get to me. You get used to the solitude after a while. Truckers thrive on it. But this was different. It felt unnatural, like something was missing. It was too quiet, too still. Even the CB chatter had dried up, leaving me with nothing but the low hum of static and the occasional crackle of interference. I reached for the radio, hoping to find some late-night talk show or even a bit of static-filled classic rock to break up the silence. But as I flipped through the stations, all I got was more static. No voices, no music, nothing. I glanced at the clock on the dash, just past 2 a.m. That's when I noticed something strange. My clock was flickering. At first I thought it was just a glitch, maybe a loose wire in the dash or a fault in the electrical system. But then I noticed something else. My GPS screen, which had been functioning perfectly, had gone black. I tapped the screen a few times, but it didn't respond. The numbers on the dash flickered again, then went out completely. My heart sank. This wasn't just a minor glitch. Something was seriously wrong. I told myself it was just electrical, nothing to worry about. But there was something in the pit of my stomach telling me otherwise. I felt a strange pressure in the air, like the world had shifted ever so slightly, and I was caught in the middle of it. I gripped the wheel tighter, my eyes scanning the empty road ahead. That's when I saw the lights. At first they were just faint specks in the distance, barely visible through the darkness. I figured it was another convoy, maybe some rigs making their way east like me. But as I got closer, I realized something was off. The lights didn't move like normal truck lights. They were slower, almost like they were drifting, hovering just above the road. And there were more of them than there should have been. 6, 7, maybe more. A whole line of them, perfectly spaced out, moving in eerie unison. A chill crept down my spine. I couldn't explain why. but something about those lights made my skin crawl. I slowed down, hesitant to get too close. Maybe they were just trucks with faulty lights, I told myself. Maybe they were dealing with the same electrical issues I was. But deep down, I knew better. As I closed the distance between us, the shape of the rigs became clearer. They were old, ancient even. The kind of trucks you don't see anymore. Rusted, battered, their paint jobs long faded by years of neglect. And the lights, they weren't headlights. They were dim, flickering like lanterns or oil lamps, casting an unnatural glow over the road. I grabbed the CB mic, my hands shaking slightly as I called out, "Breaker, breaker, this is Big Tex. Anyone got their ears on?" Nothing, just dead air. I tried again, my voice louder this time. "This is Big Tex. Got a convoy up ahead, anyone on the line?" Still nothing. The silence was suffocating. I kept my distance, trailing behind the convoy as it drifted down the highway. The fog began to roll in, thick and heavy, swirling around my rig like a blanket. I flicked on the high beams, but they barely penetrated the mist. The ghostly trucks ahead of me became blurry shadows, their flickering lights the only thing cutting through the fog. And then I noticed something else. There were no brake lights. None of the trucks ahead of me had them. In fact, there was no sign of any movement at all. The rigs just glided along the road, silent and eerie, as if they weren't touching the ground at all. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my pulse pounding in my ears. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I should have turned off the highway, found a truck stop, anything to get away from those rigs. But something kept me moving forward. It was like I was in a trance, unable to stop, unable to turn back. I stayed behind them for what felt like hours, the fog getting thicker with every mile. The world outside my cab had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the mist, and all I could see were the faint, flickering lights of the convoy ahead. Suddenly, the CB crackled to life. "Stay close, Big Tex." The voice was faint, barely audible through the static, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. I hadn't called out, and no one had responded to my earlier calls. My hand shot to the mic, gripping it tightly. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. The radio hissed, the static crackling louder before the voice came through again, clearer this time. "Stay close. Don't fall behind." I glanced up at the convoy. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see the trucks ahead of me, their lights dim and flickering like candles about to be snuffed out. My heart raced. Whoever was on the other end of that radio, they knew I was here. They knew I was following the convoy. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. I gritted my teeth, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. I'd driven these roads for years, and nothing like this had ever happened before. It had to be some kind of prank, some sick joke being played by a bunch of kids messing with my CB signal. But the voice came back. "You're with us now." My blood ran cold. I slammed my foot on the gas, desperate to get away from that voice, from the convoy, from whatever the hell was happening. The truck roared to life, the engine straining as I pushed it to its limits. I swerved into the left lane, trying to pass the convoy, but the fog was so thick I could barely see a few feet ahead. The trucks were still there, though. No matter how fast I went, no matter how hard I pushed the engine, they were always there, just ahead of me, their dim lights flickering like ghosts in the mist. And then, one by one, they began to disappear. At first, it was the last truck in the line. Its lights blinked out, swallowed by the fog. Then the next one, and the one after that. It was like they were being erased from existence, vanishing into thin air, until there was nothing left but the empty road ahead. I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I was alone again, but the fear didn't leave me. The fog still clung to the road, thick and impenetrable, and the clock on my dash was still dead. The CB crackled again. "Don't stop." I slammed the mic down, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. The road stretched out before me, endless and dark. I couldn't stop. I didn't dare stop. For the next hour, maybe longer, I drove in silence, the fog pressing in around me like a living thing. The fear had settled deep in my bones, a cold, gnawing dread that refused to let go. Finally, as dawn broke on the horizon, the fog began to lift. The world slowly came back into focus, the highway stretching out ahead, the faint outline of trees in the distance, and the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was tempered by the memory of what had just happened. I pulled into a rest stop just outside of Little Rock, my hands still shaking as I parked the rig. I climbed out, breathing in the fresh morning air, but it did little to calm my nerves. I needed answers. I needed to know what the hell had just happened. I approached another trucker at the rest stop, a guy I'd seen around a few times before. He was sipping his coffee, leaning against his rig like he didn't have a care in the world. "You ever hear of a convoy out on I-40?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He looked at me, his brow furrowing. "Convoy? What are you talking about?" I swallowed hard. A convoy. Old trucks, no brake lights, just drifting along the road. The trucker stared at me for a long moment before shaking his head. "You've been out here too long, man. There ain't no convoy like that." I wanted to argue, to tell him what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. He finished his coffee, gave me a pat on the shoulder, and walked back to his rig, leaving me standing there, alone. As I climbed back into my cab, I glanced at the clock on the dash. It had started working again, ticking along like normal. The GPS was back online too, showing my location just outside of Little Rock, right where I was supposed to be. But I knew better. Something had happened out on that highway, something I couldn't explain. And no matter how hard I tried to forget it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there, that the ghostly convoy was still somewhere on those dark roads, waiting for the next trucker to fall in behind them. And now, every time I drive through the night, every time the fog rolls in and the CB goes quiet, I can't help but glance in my mirrors, half expecting to see those flickering lights behind me. Because some stories aren't just stories. Some of them are real. I've been driving rigs for over 20 years, and in all that time I've learned one thing. You don't let fatigue get the better of you. Most accidents happen because some guy behind the wheel thought he could push through another hour or two. I've never been that guy. When I'm tired, I stop, no matter what. That's why when my eyes started getting heavy somewhere along Route 93 in Nevada, I knew I needed to find a place to pull over. It was well past midnight. The road stretched out ahead of me like a ribbon of endless darkness, and there wasn't another vehicle in sight. The radio was dead air, and the only thing keeping me company was the low rumble of the engine and the occasional clink of my coffee thermos against the cup holder. I hadn't seen a rest stop sign in miles, and my options were looking slim. Normally, I plan my routes better, but this haul had been a last-minute job. The kind of job where the dispatcher calls you up out of nowhere, offers a fat bonus for fast delivery, and you say yes before you can ask the details. The cargo wasn't anything special, just a load of electronics headed for a warehouse in Las Vegas. But the tight schedule meant I didn't have the luxury of taking it slow. I squinted at the road, the long stretch of black asphalt starting to blur around the edges. My vision had that weird fuzziness you get when you're too tired to be driving. I had to pull over soon, or I'd risk dozing off at the wheel. And that's a death sentence for any trucker. That's when I saw it. A small, weathered sign on the side of the road, almost hidden by overgrown brush. It was one of those old metal signs, rusted around the edges, the kind you don't see much anymore. The paint was faded, but I could just make out the words, "Rest stop, 1 mile." Relief washed over me. I hadn't seen it on the GPS, but I wasn't about to argue with the opportunity for a place to park for a few hours. 1 more mile, and I could be out of the truck, stretching my legs and catching a quick nap before hitting the road again. I slowed the rig down, my eyes scanning the darkness for the turnoff. The headlights bounced along the uneven road, and just when I thought I might have missed it, I spotted the narrow exit ramp. No sign, no lights, just a small dirt road leading off into the night. I hesitated for a moment. It didn't look like your standard rest stop. Usually there's a parking lot, a couple of vending machines, maybe a bathroom. This just looked like a dirt road leading into the trees, but I was too tired to care. As long as there was a place to park, I'd be happy. I took the turn, the tires crunching over gravel as I followed the road into the darkness. The trees closed in around me, tall pines that seemed to loom over the truck, casting long shadows across the path. The further I drove, the more isolated it felt. There were no lights, no other vehicles, just the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the thick night. After what felt like forever, the road opened up into a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a dirt lot with enough room for a few trucks, though mine was the only one there. There were no buildings, no vending machines, not even a porta-potty. Just an old picnic table, half rotten from years of neglect, and a trash can tipped over on its side. I killed the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening after hours of driving. I sat there for a moment, rubbing my eyes and trying to shake off the exhaustion. Something about the place felt wrong, but I chalked it up to the fatigue. When you're tired, everything feels off. Climbing out of the cab, I stretched, the cool night air biting at my skin. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, and the stars barely broke through the thick canopy of trees. I hadn't realized how remote this place was until I was standing there in the dark, alone. It was eerie, sure, but I was too tired to care. I figured I'd lock up, maybe stretch my legs for a few minutes, and then catch a few hours of sleep. As I walked around the truck, my boots crunching on the gravel, I heard it. A soft sound, like footsteps on the dirt. I froze, straining my ears to listen. But after a few seconds, all I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees. I shook my head, muttering to myself. Just the wind, I thought. Or maybe an animal moving through the brush. Nothing to worry about. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I checked the locks on the back of the truck, making sure everything was secure, then headed back toward the cab. That's when I heard it again. This time it was clearer. Definite footsteps. Not mine. Not an animal. Someone was out there. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness of the night. No response. I stood there listening, waiting for something, anything, but the only sound was the wind. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I was tired. My mind was playing tricks on me. That had to be it. I'd been on the road for hours, and fatigue was messing with my head. I needed sleep. Once I got a few hours, everything would feel normal again. I climbed back into the cab, locked the doors, and leaned back in the seat. The truck felt safe, familiar. I'd spent more nights in this cab than I could count, and it was my sanctuary out on the road. No matter what was out there, I was safe in here. I shut my eyes, letting the fatigue wash over me. But sleep didn't come. My mind was too busy, too alert. Every creak, every rustle outside the truck made my heart race. I couldn't stop thinking about those footsteps. I'd heard them. I knew I had. After what felt like an hour of tossing and turning, I gave up on sleep. I sat up, my body tense, and stared out into the night. The clearing was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. But something was off. It felt like the whole forest was watching me, waiting. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, between the trees, there was a figure. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was standing there, watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the figure, my mind racing. Who the hell was out here? This rest stop was in the middle of nowhere, and there hadn't been a single vehicle on the road for miles. Whoever it was, they didn't belong here. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove box, flicked it on, and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but the figure was gone. I swept the light back and forth, my pulse hammering in my ears. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a shadow or a trick of the moonlight. But then the footsteps came again, louder this time, closer. I dropped the flashlight, my hands shaking as I scrambled to lock the doors again, even though they were already locked. My brain was screaming at me to get out of there, to leave this place and never look back. But the truck wasn't moving. I wasn't moving. And then I saw it again, the figure this time closer, standing at the edge of the clearing, just at the line where the trees ended and the dirt lot began. It was tall, too tall to be a normal person, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. I grabbed the keys, my fingers trembling, and jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, the headlights flicking on and illuminating the clearing, but the figure was gone again, vanished into the night. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out of the lot, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the narrow dirt road. The trees whipped by, the road winding sharply as I pushed the rig faster than I should have. My heart was racing, my mind replaying the image of that figure over and over again. What the hell was that thing? And why was it out there, in the middle of nowhere, watching me? The road felt longer than it should have. It seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around me, the darkness pressing against the windows. My mind was racing, desperate to get back to the main highway, to the safety of the open road. I just needed to get out of there, to put as much distance between me and that rest stop as possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the main road ahead, the familiar strip of asphalt cutting through the wilderness. I breathed a sigh of relief as I pulled back onto the highway, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I drove for hours after that, not daring to stop until I saw the first hints of dawn on the horizon. By the time the sun was up, I was back on familiar ground, the landscape of Nevada stretching out before me in the harsh light of day. I pulled into the first truck stop I saw, parked the rig, and stepped out into the morning air, my legs shaky beneath me. The place was busy, other truckers milling about, fueling up, grabbing coffee. It felt normal, safe. But I couldn't shake the memory of that rest stop, the unmarked clearing in the middle of nowhere, the footsteps, the figure watching from the trees. I asked around about it at the diner. Some of the older truckers had heard stories, rumors of an old rest stop that had been closed for years, a place where people had gone missing, where strange things happened. But no one could give me any solid answers. Just more stories, more legends passed around late at night. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and hit the road again, determined to put the whole thing behind me. But I haven't been able to forget. Every time I'm out on a long haul, every time I see an unmarked turnoff or an old rusted sign, I think about that night. And I wonder if that figure is still out there, waiting for the next trucker who's too tired to keep driving. Because one thing's for sure, I'll never stop at an unmarked rest stop again. Being a trucker means you learn to accept the unknown. You're given a load, you drive, and most of the time you don't think too much about what's in the back. Electronics, machinery, furniture, it's all just cargo. But sometimes you get a job that sticks with you, one you can't forget, no matter how hard you try. This is one of those stories. It was a late October night, just after midnight, when I got the call. I was sitting in the cab of my rig at a truck stop just outside Flagstaff, enjoying a rare moment of peace. My haul to Phoenix was set for the next morning, and I was planning to get some shut-eye before hitting the road. Then the phone rang. "Got a special load for you," the dispatcher said. "High priority. Bonus if you get it there by dawn." I'd been in the game long enough to know that special load usually meant something shady. But I needed the money, and the promise of a fat bonus was enough to make me ignore any gut feelings I might have had. The instructions were vague. Pick up the trailer at a small yard on the outskirts of town. No paperwork and no questions. I should have asked questions, but I didn't. I pulled into the yard just before 1 a.m. It was one of those forgotten places, tucked away behind a chain-link fence and a few rusting warehouses. The only light came from a single flickering street lamp, casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. There was one trailer, sitting alone at the back of the lot. It was covered in a thick, heavy tarp, secured with chains and locks. I didn't know what was under the tarp, and the dispatcher hadn't told me, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. I brushed it off. A job's a job, right? I hooked up the trailer, checked the locks, and was about to climb back into the cab when a voice called out from the darkness. "You the driver?" I turned and saw a man stepping out from behind the warehouse. He was tall, dressed in a long, dark coat that looked out of place in the Arizona desert. His face was shadowed, but I could see his eyes, cold, unblinking, like he'd seen things I wouldn't want to know about. "Yeah, I'm the driver," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "This your load?" He nodded, walking slowly toward the truck. "Just make sure it gets where it needs to go. Don't stop, don't open the trailer, and don't ask questions." That was the last thing he said before he disappeared back into the shadows. I stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where he'd been, feeling a sense of dread creeping over me. But I pushed it down, climbed into the cab, and fired up the engine. I'd done plenty of weird jobs before, and this one was no different. Or so I told myself. The GPS directed me down the old highway, a long, deserted stretch of road that wound through the desert toward the Nevada border. There were no towns, no gas stations, just miles and miles of empty asphalt cutting through the dark. Perfect for a night run, or at least that's what I thought. The first few hours passed without incident. The road was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural. No other cars, no lights on the horizon, just me and the steady rumble of the engine. I turned on the radio, hoping for some music or late-night chatter, but all I got was static. The desert swallowed the sound, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the faint, unsettling hum from the trailer behind me. It wasn't long before I noticed the first strange thing. The trailer wasn't quiet. At first it was subtle, a faint rustling sound like something shifting inside. I brushed it off, figuring it was just the load settling as we moved. But the further I drove, the louder it got. It wasn't just rustling anymore. It was scratching. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, but then growing louder, more insistent, like something was trying to get out. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something back there, but all I saw was the dark outline of the tarp-covered trailer. My heart started racing, and I forced myself to focus on the road. The guy said not to open it. I wasn't going to open it, but the scratching didn't stop. By the time I hit the halfway point, it had turned into full-blown thumping. It was steady, rhythmic, like someone, or something, was banging against the inside of the trailer. I cranked up the radio, trying to drown it out, but the static was all I could hear. The thumping grew louder, faster, as if whatever was inside was getting desperate. I knew I should stop, check the load, make sure everything was secure. But that man's warning echoed in my head. Don't stop, don't open the trailer. I didn't know what was in there, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I kept driving. The further I went, the worse it got. The scratching turned to scraping, and the thumping became more erratic, more violent. My palms were slick with sweat, and my hands shook on the wheel. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my heart pounding in my ears. I was alone out here, miles from anywhere, and something was wrong, very wrong. I tried to ignore it, tried to keep my focus on the road, but then the truck shuddered. It wasn't a pothole or a gust of wind. The entire rig shook, like something had slammed into the side of the trailer. I swore under my breath, gripping the wheel tighter as the truck swayed. It happened again. Another hard hit from the back, followed by a screeching sound that sent a chill down my spine. Whatever was in that trailer, it wanted out. The highway was empty. I hadn't seen another vehicle for miles, and there were no rest stops, no gas stations, no towns. Just endless darkness stretching out in front of me. I checked the GPS. Still another 2 hours to the destination. I wasn't going to make it. I glanced in the rear-view mirror again, my stomach tightening into knots. The tarp covering the trailer was moving. It shifted in the wind, or at least that's what I told myself. But then I saw it. Something pressing against the tarp from the inside. A shape, barely visible in the darkness, pushing and straining against the chains that held the tarp in place. I slammed my foot on the gas, the engine roaring as the truck lurched forward. The tarp bulged, stretching under the pressure, and I could hear the chains creaking, straining to hold whatever was inside. And then I heard it, a voice. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. I was exhausted, my nerves shot, and the sound was faint, barely audible over the engine and the thumping. But it was there, a whisper, low and insistent, coming from the back of the trailer. "Let us out." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was muffled, distorted. But there was no mistaking it. Something was inside that trailer, and it was talking to me. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I was just tired. That was it. I was exhausted, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the voice came again, louder this time. "Let us out!" I slammed the radio, trying to find any station, any noise to drown out the sound. But all I got was static. The voice kept going, relentless, seeping into my head like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. "Let us out! Let us out!" The trailer shook violently, the tarp straining as something slammed against it from the inside. The chains rattled, the sound like nails on a chalkboard, and I could feel the entire rig swaying under the force of it. I couldn't take it anymore. Against my better judgment, against every instinct telling me to keep driving, I pulled the truck to the side of the road. The tires skidded on the gravel, the engine sputtering as I threw it into park. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the flashlight from the glove box and stepped out into the night. The desert was dead silent, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind through the scrub. I could hear the thumping from the trailer, loud and clear now, and the chains rattling like bones in the dark. My heart was pounding in my chest as I approached the back of the rig, the flashlight beam cutting through the night. The tarp bulged outward, the shape pressing against it more defined now. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. The limbs were too long, the form too distorted. I could hear the scratching again, that awful, relentless scraping as whatever was inside clawed at the walls of the trailer. I reached for the lock, my hand trembling. I didn't want to do it, but I couldn't stop myself. The voice was louder now, clearer, echoing in my head. "Let us out." The lock clicked open, and then everything went still. The thumping stopped. The scratching ceased. The trailer was silent, the chains no longer rattling. I stood there, my hand on the latch, waiting for something. Anything. But the night was dead quiet. I took a step back, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Whatever was in that trailer, it wasn't moving anymore. The tarp hung limp, the shape gone, as if it had never been there at all. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I closed the lock and stepped away from the trailer. My hands were still shaking as I climbed back into the cab, slammed the door, and fired up the engine. I didn't care about the load. I didn't care about the bonus. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I saw the lights of the city on the horizon. By the time I reached the drop-off point, dawn was breaking, and I was running on pure adrenaline. I didn't wait for instructions. I unhooked the trailer, left it in the lot, and got out of there as fast as I could. I never found out what was in that trailer. Never asked. Whatever it was, I didn't want to know. All I know is that I'll never take a special load again. There are some places you just don't want to drive, no matter how much they pay you. Every trucker has a story about a route they'd never take again, either because of the terrain, the isolation, or something else, something they can't quite explain. For me, that place is Deadman's Curve. I'd heard about it plenty of times over the years. Every trucker on the East Coast knows the stories. It's an old stretch of highway in the Appalachian Mountains, just a few miles off the main route. The official name is State Route 66, but no one calls it that. It's always been Deadman's Curve, a twisty, narrow road that hugs the mountainside, with cliffs on one side and dense forest on the other. The stories say more rigs have gone off that cliff than anyone cares to count, but that's not the worst of it. The real horror, they say, is what happens at the last stop before the curve. I never put much stock in ghost stories, but I'd been avoiding that route for years. Something about it just didn't sit right with me. So when my dispatcher called and offered me double my normal rate for a late-night haul through that very stretch of road, I was torn. It was the kind of money that could take care of a lot of bills, but I knew what I'd be getting into. Still, the temptation was too strong. I said yes. The load was simple enough, just a bunch of auto parts headed to a warehouse in West Virginia. The route was supposed to take me straight through the mountains, with Deadman's Curve as the only real obstacle. I told myself I could handle it. After all, I'd driven worse roads before. I set out just before midnight, thinking the darkness would help me avoid traffic. The highway was empty, as I expected, the moon hanging low in the sky, casting a cold glow over the asphalt. I drove in silence for the first hour or so, the only sounds coming from the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB. But as I got closer to the mountains, something changed. It was subtle at first. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the atmosphere had shifted. The stars above seemed to dim, as if a haze had settled over the sky. My headlights cut through the darkness, but it felt like the world outside my truck was shrinking, closing in around me. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the isolation getting to me. There weren't any cars around, and I hadn't seen another truck in miles. It was just me, the road, and the mountains ahead. The first real sign of trouble came when I passed a road sign. Old, rusted, almost impossible to read. But I knew what it said. Deadman's Curve, 5 miles. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I'd been expecting it, but seeing the sign made it real. I still had a few miles to go, but the anticipation was worse than I thought it would be. My palms were slick on the wheel, and I could feel my heart starting to race. Just as I was starting to talk myself down, I saw the rest stop. It wasn't marked on the GPS, and I hadn't seen any signs for it, but there it was. An old, run-down lot with a few broken-down trucks parked in the shadows. The place looked like it hadn't been used in years. The building was small, one of those old-timey diners with a few gas pumps out front and a flickering neon sign that read, "Last Stop." The neon buzzed faintly in the night, casting a sickly orange glow over the cracked pavement. I didn't need to stop. I had plenty of fuel, and I was already behind schedule. But something about the place drew me in. I told myself I'd just pull over for a minute, maybe stretch my legs, clear my head before tackling the curve. So, I turned into the lot. The moment I shut off the engine, the silence hit me. It was oppressive, like the world had gone dead the second I'd stopped moving. No wind, no crickets, no distant highway noise. Just complete, unnerving stillness. I sat there for a moment staring at the diner, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that was creeping up my spine. There were a few other rigs parked around the lot, old ones, way older than anything you'd see on the road today. They were covered in rust, their paint faded, like they'd been sitting there for decades. I didn't see any drivers. No one coming or going. Just those silent, forgotten trucks. I stepped out of the cab, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound in the still night. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for October, and I could see my breath in the faint light from the diner's sign. The place felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. I couldn't explain it, but something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I should have gotten back in the truck and kept driving, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked toward the diner, half expecting the door to be locked, but it wasn't. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit with the smell of stale coffee and old grease. The place was empty save for a few cracked vinyl booths and a dusty counter. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the floor. I could hear the faint hum of a refrigerator in the back, but there was no sign of anyone working there. I walked up to the counter, half-heartedly calling out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No answer. I stood there for a moment, feeling more and more uneasy by the second. I was about to turn around and head back to the truck when I heard a noise, soft at first but growing louder. It was a scraping sound, like metal on metal, coming from the back of the diner. My heart skipped a beat, and I strained to listen. That's when I saw him. A man stepped out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. He was tall, his face gaunt and pale, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes were sunken, and his clothes looked like they hadn't been washed in months. He gave me a nod, like he'd been expecting me. "Need something?" he asked, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken in a while. I cleared my throat, trying to steady my nerves. "Just passing through," I said. "Thought I'd stretch my legs." The man stared at me for a moment, then shrugged. "Not many people stop here anymore." I nodded, not sure what else to say. The air in the diner felt thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel sweat forming on the back of my neck. I glanced at the door, half ready to bolt. "Where you headed?" the man asked, breaking the silence. "West Virginia," I replied. "Got a load to drop off by morning." The man's expression darkened. "You planning to take Deadman's Curve?" I hesitated, then nodded. He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Not a good idea, friend. Not at this time of night." I didn't respond. I didn't want to hear whatever warning he had. I just wanted to get back on the road and get this over with. But he kept talking. "Too many drivers don't make it through that curve," he said, his voice lowering. "Rigs go off the cliff. They disappear, and no one ever finds them." I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the fear gnawing at my gut. "I've heard the stories," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it's just a road. I'll be fine." The man didn't smile. He just stared at me, his eyes hollow and cold. "You won't be the first to think that." Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to ask him more, to find out what he knew, but a wave of panic suddenly washed over me. I needed to leave, now. I turned on my heel and headed for the door, not bothering to say goodbye. As I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap in the face. The diner's neon sign buzzed louder now, its flickering light casting eerie shadows across the lot. I glanced at the old trucks again, half expecting to see someone sitting in one of them, but they were just as empty as before. I climbed back into my rig, slammed the door shut and locked it. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I pulled out of the lot without looking back. The road ahead was dark, the trees on either side seeming to close in as I approached Deadman's Curve. My headlights cut through the fog that had started to roll in, thick and heavy, swallowing the edges of the road. The fear was still gnawing at me, but I pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand. The curve was just ahead. I could see the faint outline of the cliffs, the drop-off barely visible through the mist. I slowed the truck, gripping the wheel tight as I approached the turn. But something was wrong. The fog was thicker now, so thick that I could barely see the road in front of me. And then, just as I was about to make the turn, I saw them. Figures, shadowy, distorted, standing at the edge of the road. At first I thought it was just the fog playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, I could make out their shapes. There were 5 of them, maybe 6, standing in a line just a few feet from the cliff's edge. They were dressed in old clothes, like something out of another era. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were hollow. They were watching me. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop just before the curve. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands trembling on the wheel. I stared at the figures, unable to move, unable to look away. And then they were gone. Just like that, they vanished into the fog, leaving nothing behind but the faint echo of their presence. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But there was no explanation, no rational answer. Those figures, those people, they weren't real. They couldn't be real. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew they were the drivers who never made it through Deadman's curve. Without another thought, I threw the truck into gear and sped away, not caring about the curve, not caring about anything but getting away from that place. The road twisted and turned beneath me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the warehouse in West Virginia, the sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the landscape. I parked the truck, my hands still shaking, and climbed out. I never took that route again. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. Deadman's Curve isn't just a road. It's a trap, a place where the past lingers, waiting for the next driver foolish enough to think they can make it through. And I was almost one of them. I've always loved the open highway. There's something freeing about it. Just you, the truck, and the road stretching out as far as the eye can see. No traffic, no city noise, just miles and miles of blacktop and the hum of the engine. I've been a trucker for more than 20 years, and in all that time, I've never felt anything but peace out on the road. Until that night. It started like any other haul. I was taking a load of furniture from Chicago to a small town in Oregon, which meant a long stretch across the plains and through the mountains. Nothing unusual. The route was familiar, and I'd driven it more times than I could count. I had my thermos full of coffee, the radio tuned to some classic rock station, and the GPS guiding me through every turn. It was just after midnight when I hit a particularly isolated stretch of highway somewhere in Idaho. The moon was high, casting a silver glow over the road, and the air was crisp and still, the kind of night truckers dream about. I figured I'd make good time and be able to take a break at a rest stop up ahead. That's when the GPS started acting up. I glanced at the screen and saw the route recalculating, the blue line disappearing and reappearing in strange loops. It wasn't the first time I'd had a GPS glitch out in the middle of nowhere, so I didn't think much of it. I had a good sense of direction and I knew I was still on track. I figured it would sort itself out in a few minutes. But then the road signs stopped. I hadn't seen another car in a while, nothing unusual for this part of the country, but the lack of road signs was strange. No mile markers, no exit signs, not even the usual billboards advertising truck stops and motels. Just an endless ribbon of road stretching out in front of me, disappearing into the darkness. I checked the GPS again. It was still looping, the little blue line tracing the same section of highway over and over. I frowned and tapped the screen, but nothing changed. The road on the GPS didn't match what I was seeing out of the windshield. According to the screen, I hadn't moved for the past 30 minutes. That was impossible. I slowed down, squinting at the highway ahead. The moonlight made everything look strange, casting long, eerie shadows over the asphalt. I passed under an overpass. At least I thought I did. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, it wasn't there. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Something was wrong. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and the GPS, which was now completely useless. The blue line had disappeared altogether, leaving nothing but a blank screen. I tried switching it off and on again, but it didn't respond. I grabbed my phone, and opened up Google Maps, but it wouldn't load either. No signal, no data. The road stretched on, unbroken, unchanging. There was no exit, no rest stop, no gas station, nothing but the same 2 lanes of blacktop and the distant shadowy outline of mountains on the horizon. I checked the clock on the dash. 1:17 a.m. That's when the unease really started to settle in. I'd been driving for well over an hour since the GPS first glitched, but the clock had barely moved. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that was creeping into my thoughts. I was just tired. That had to be it. I'd been on the road for hours, and fatigue was messing with my perception. But as the minutes dragged on, the sense of dread only grew stronger. The highway was too empty, too quiet. There wasn't a single car in sight, and the horizon never seemed to get any closer. It was like I was stuck in some kind of loop, driving the same stretch of road over and over again. I turned on the radio, hoping for some distraction, but all I got was static. I twisted the dial, scanning through the frequencies, but every station was the same. Just an endless hiss of white noise. I tried the CB next, calling out to see if any other truckers were in the area. "Breaker, breaker, this is Big Mike. Anyone got their ears on?" Nothing. "Big Mike to any truckers out there. You copy?" More static. I felt the tension in my chest tightening. I'd never been in a situation like this before. I'd driven through storms, floods, even a couple of blizzards, but I'd always known where I was, always had a way to communicate. But now it felt like I was completely cut off, alone. I kept driving, trying to shake the gnawing sense of panic that was rising in my gut. I knew I had to be close to a town by now. There was no way this road could go on forever. I just needed to keep moving. But the further I drove, the more the road seemed to stretch, like some kind of nightmare that wouldn't end. The moon hung in the same spot in the sky, unmoving, as if time itself had frozen. The shadows on the road grew longer, darker, but the scenery never changed. I checked the clock again. 1:17 a.m. My heart skipped a beat. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop in the middle of the empty highway. I stared at the dashboard, my pulse hammering in my ears. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It didn't make any sense. I'd been driving for hours, but the clock hadn't moved at all. I grabbed my phone again, but it was dead. Not out of battery. Dead. The screen wouldn't turn on, no matter how many times I pressed the button. I tossed it onto the passenger seat, my hands shaking. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just a weird electrical glitch. Maybe I'd been driving on autopilot and didn't notice the time passing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was wrong with this road. Something was wrong with me. I checked the rear-view mirror. The road behind me was empty, stretching back into the darkness, just like the road ahead. No lights, no other vehicles, no sign of life. It was like I was the only person left in the world. I put the truck back in gear and started driving again, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, but my mind was racing. What the hell was going on? How had I gotten here? And more importantly, how was I going to get out? I must have driven for another hour, maybe 2, but it felt like time had stopped. The landscape was a blur of shadows and moonlight, the highway stretching on forever, with no end in sight. And then I saw it. Up ahead, just barely visible in the dim light, was a figure, a man, standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes again, my heart leaping into my throat. The truck screeched to a stop, the tires skidding on the asphalt. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, his back to me, motionless. For a moment I thought I was seeing things. Maybe the fatigue was finally catching up to me, and my mind was playing tricks. But as I sat there, staring at the figure, I realized he was real. Too real. He was tall, dressed in what looked like an old, worn-out suit. His clothes were covered in dust, his posture rigid, like he'd been standing there for hours, maybe longer. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached the figure. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. "You all right?" The man didn't respond. I moved closer, shining the flashlight at him. The beam illuminated his back, casting long shadows across the road. He still didn't move. Something was wrong. "Sir?" I called out again, my voice shaking. I was only a few feet away from him now. I could see the dust clinging to his suit, the way his shoulders slumped forward like he was exhausted. His hands hung limply at his sides, his fingers twitching slightly, but he didn't turn around. I reached out, hesitating for just a second before tapping him on the shoulder. The man turned. My blood ran cold. His face, what was left of it, was gaunt, hollow, like a corpse that had been left out in the sun for too long. His skin was stretched tight over his skull, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets, staring at me with a vacant, lifeless gaze. His mouth hung open, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the ground. The man didn't move. He just stared at me, his hollow eyes boring into mine. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fumbled for the door of the truck. I could feel his gaze on me, even as I slammed the door shut and threw the truck into gear. I didn't look back. The truck roared to life, the tires screeching as I sped down the highway, my hands shaking on the wheel. The road stretched on, the shadows growing darker, deeper, as I drove faster and faster, desperate to escape. But no matter how far I drove, the man's face was burned into my mind. That hollow, lifeless stare, the empty road, the feeling that I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, a loop I couldn't escape. I don't know how long I drove. Hours, maybe. Or maybe just minutes. Time didn't seem to work the way it was supposed to anymore. Finally, just as the first hints of dawn began to break on the horizon, I saw it. A sign. Next exit, 1 mile. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding over me. I wasn't sure where I was or how I'd gotten there, but it didn't matter. I just needed to get off this road. I turned the wheel, pulling onto the exit ramp, and headed toward the lights of a small gas station in the distance. When I finally pulled into the lot, I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands trembling on the wheel. The world seemed to snap back into focus, the weight of the night lifting as the sun began to rise. I climbed out of the truck, breathing in the fresh morning air, and walked toward the gas station. The clerk inside looked up as I entered, giving me a nod. "Long night?" he asked, his voice casual. I nodded, too shaken to speak. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't tell anyone, because I'm still not sure it really did. But I haven't driven that stretch of highway since, and I never will.